What if everything you thought you knew was just the thin surface of a much deeper reality? We go deeper than anyone else to find the raw, unfiltered truth of the human condition. Subscribe now and see the world for yourself.
The moment my director slammed both palms on the conference table and said, "Sit down, Maya. You're embarrassing this entire agency," I felt every pair of eyes in that room turn toward me like a spotlight I hadn't asked for. I kept my hands still. I kept my face neutral. I picked up my portfolio binder, closed it slowly, and walked to the empty chair along the wall, the one reserved for junior staff, the observers, the people who weren't supposed to matter. He thought he had just crushed me. He had no idea that 60 seconds earlier, my phone had buzzed with a message from the woman sitting directly across from him. The woman whose company had just handed our agency a $2 million contract to fight over. The message said, "Don't leave the building, I need 5 minutes with you alone." Her name was Diane Vasquez. And what she was about to say to my director would change everything. I need to back up, because the way this story ends only makes sense if you understand how it began. My name is Maya. I'm a senior creative director, or at least, I was supposed to be. I'd been at Hartwell and Cross for 4 years by the time any of this happened. 4 years of late nights, client revisions, campaigns that won regional awards my director accepted on behalf of the team without once saying any of our names at the podium. I knew how the game worked. I had watched it work on people before me. I told myself I was different because I documented everything, kept my files organized with timestamps, and never once sent a creative brief from my personal email. I thought being careful was the same as being protected. I was wrong. The pitch for Vantera, a luxury skincare brand expanding into the US market, was the biggest opportunity Hartwell and Cross had seen in 3 years. Diane Vasquez was their chief marketing officer, and she had requested a full brand identity overhaul. Visual language, campaign concept, tone of voice, the works. The budget was $2 million for the first phase alone. My director, whose name was Brandon, had assigned the project to me in February. "You're the best we have on visual narrative," he told me, which I knew was true and also knew was the kind of compliment that arrives attached to an enormous amount of unpaid labor. I spent 11 weeks on that pitch. 11 weeks building a brand world from scratch, the color palette inspired by the mineral-rich cliffs of coastal Portugal, the typography system that referenced early 20th century French apothecary labels, the campaign concept I called The Ritual, which positioned Vantera not as a product but as a practice. I wrote the deck myself. I designed every slide. I built the concept video with our motion designer, a quiet and meticulous woman named Priya, who worked with me until 10 o'clock on 4 consecutive Thursday nights. Priya and I both had our names on the internal project folder. We both had our email threads, our revision history, our file metadata with creation dates going back to the first week of February. Brandon had a folder too. He'd added himself to the project in week 9. I noticed it. I told myself it was standard procedure for a director to have access before a major pitch. I told myself a lot of things that I now understand were ways of not seeing something I wasn't ready to deal with. The presentation was scheduled for a Thursday morning in April at Hartwell and Cross's downtown offices. Diane Vasquez was flying in from their headquarters in Chicago with 2 members of her team. Brandon had booked the glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor, the one with the skyline view that clients always photographed for their Instagram stories. The night before, I sent Brandon the final deck. He replied at 11:45 p.m. "Got it. I'll take it from here. You and Priya be there at 9, ready to answer technical questions if needed." That was not what we had agreed. We had agreed, in a conversation 3 weeks earlier that I had saved as a voice memo on my phone without telling him, that I would lead the presentation. That Priya and I would walk Diane Vasquez through the concept together, as the people who had actually built it. I replied, "Just to confirm, I'll be presenting the creative sections, right? And Priya the motion work." He didn't respond that night. The next morning, I arrived at 8:30. Priya was already there, at the far end of the conference table, setting up her laptop. Brandon was at the head of the table, scrolling through the deck on the presentation display. He looked up when I walked in and said, without preamble, "I'm leading today. You two are here as support." "Brandon," I said, because 4 years had taught me not to raise my voice in this building, "we discussed this. I built this deck. Priya and I can speak to every decision in here, and if Diane's team asks technical questions, I'll handle the questions, he said. That's what I'm here for. Diane Vasquez arrived at 9:02 with a woman named Claire from her brand team and a man named Marcus who turned out to be her creative consultant. They were warm, focused, professionally curious. Diane shook my hand and said she had heard good things about the work coming out of our team, and I noticed she said team, not Brandon. Brandon presented the ritual concept in 41 minutes. I know because I was watching the clock on the wall the entire time, the way you watch something that belongs to you being held by someone else's hands. He used the right words. He had read my deck carefully enough to echo my language. To say visual narrative and tactile memory and the apothecary heritage the way I had written them. But language is not the same as understanding. And when Marcus, the creative consultant, leaned forward about 20 minutes in and asked, "Can you walk us through the rationale behind the typography system, specifically the serif choice for the secondary hierarchy?" Brandon paused. It was a brief pause. Maybe 2 seconds. But I felt it land on Priya across the table like a stone dropped in still water. "It's rooted in early 20th century French pharmaceutical design," Brandon said, which was technically correct and completely insufficient. Marcus nodded slowly. "Right, but the specific pairing, the grotesque for the primary and the transitional for secondary, that's an interesting tension." "What was the intent there?" Brandon said, "The intent was contrast. Modernity against heritage." Marcus looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at me. I did not move. I did not speak. I had not been invited to speak. Brandon continued. He moved to the campaign concept, to the ritual, to the visual world I had spent weeks building. He presented the concept video, Priya's motion work, her camera treatments, her pacing choices, and I watched Diane Vasquez watch it with the focused, almost private expression of someone genuinely moved by something. When it finished, she said, "This is exceptional. Whoever built this understood something very specific about what we're trying to say." Brandon said, "Thank you. We're very proud of what the team put together." Diane looked at him. Then she looked at me again. Then she looked at Priya. And I noticed, though I told myself I was imagining it, that she looked at us for slightly longer than the moment required. That was when Brandon made his mistake. He moved to the budget slide and said, "Now, in terms of execution, I want to walk you through how I would approach the rollout." And Marcus said, very calmly, "Sorry, before we move on. The concept video. The color language throughout this deck. Who developed the brand name The Ritual? Was that internal or did you bring in outside brand strategy?" Brandon said, "That was developed in-house, under my direction." Priya made a very small sound. It wasn't loud enough for anyone across the table to hear. But I heard it. And then my phone buzzed. I looked down. A message from a number I didn't recognize, sent to the work email address printed on my business card. "Don't leave the building after this. I need 5 minutes with you alone. D. Vasquez." I read it twice. I kept my expression exactly the same. I placed my phone face down on the table. Brandon was still talking. I don't know exactly how Diane knew. I learned pieces of it later. From the conversation we had in the small meeting room on the 12th floor. While Brandon was upstairs fielding a follow-up call from Claire about contract logistics. A call that Diane had arranged deliberately to give herself time away from him. She closed the door and sat across from me and said, without any performance, "I've seen that typography rationale before. Almost word for word. You wrote the strategic brief for the Alden launch 3 years ago, didn't you? At Callaway Design." I stared at her. "I was on the client side for that project," she said. "Different company, different role." I remembered the brief because it was one of the best pieces of brand thinking I'd encountered that year. Same voice. Same structural logic. Same way of building an argument from material history into contemporary application. She paused. "That was yours." "Yes," I said. "And this pitch," she said, "is also yours." "Yes." She nodded once, the way people nod when a thing they suspected is confirmed, and the confirmation is both satisfying and troubling. "Tell me about the typography system," she said. "The grotesque and the transitional. Why that pairing?" And I told her. I told her about the tension I was trying to create between accessibility and authority, between the clinical and the intimate, between a product you could trust medically, and an experience you could surrender to emotionally. I told her about the 3 weeks I spent pulling reference from turn-of-the-century French pharmacy labels, from perfume house archives, from letters written by women in the 1920s describing their skincare routines as acts of private ceremony. She listened with her hands folded on the table, perfectly still. When I finished, she said, "Does your director have any of the original files? The working documents, the brief, the reference archive?" "No," I said. "He was added to the project folder in week 9. The time-stamped originals are in my personal project drive and on the agency server under my login." She was quiet for a moment. "I want to ask you something," she said, "and I want you to answer honestly, not carefully." She looked at me directly. "Is this the first time this has happened to you here?" I thought about the regional award Brandon accepted in Boston. I thought about the brand refresh for a healthcare client the previous year, credited to the Hartwell and Cross creative team in the press release with Brandon's name listed as creative lead. I thought about Priya, sitting upstairs right now, probably saying nothing to anyone. "No," I said. Diane Vasquez looked at me for a long moment. Then she took out her phone. "I want to tell you that what happened next was swift and cinematic." It wasn't. What happened next was methodical and took about 3 weeks, and most of it I experienced secondhand, through a combination of a call from Hartwell and Cross's HR director and a series of increasingly formal emails. Diane had requested, through her company's legal team, the original project files for the Vantera pitch, specifically the metadata, the creation timestamps, the version history, and the email chain authorizing the project. She had also requested, as a matter of professional due diligence before signing a $2 million contract, a written statement from the named creative lead describing the conceptual development of the ritual campaign. Brandon's written statement was submitted to Diane's team on a Monday. On Tuesday afternoon, Diane's team compared it against the timestamped brief I had shared through proper channels, with HR present, and the discrepancies were not subtle. Brandon's statement described a conceptual process that began in late March. My files showed work beginning February 3rd. The metadata, as my friend in the IT department once told me when I asked a casual question about how file histories work, doesn't lie. It doesn't have a reason to. By Thursday of that week, Brandon had been placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. By the following Monday, Hartwell and Cross had retained outside counsel. I was told none of this directly. I was told through the careful, neutral language of HR emails that my records had been reviewed and found to accurately represent my contributions to the project. Priya was told the same thing. What I was told directly, in a phone call from Diane Vasquez on a Wednesday evening 3 weeks after the pitch, was this: "Vantara is moving forward with the campaign. We would like you to lead the execution as a direct engagement, your own contract, your own team, reporting to me. The scope is the same. The budget is intact. If you want it, the offer is real and I'll have the paperwork sent tomorrow." I was standing in my kitchen when she called. I had a dish towel over my shoulder. I had been, up until that moment, reheating pasta and not thinking about anything in particular. I said, "I want it." She said, "One more thing, do you want to bring your motion designer?" I thought about Priya. About the 4 Thursday nights. About the small sound she had made when Brandon said the work was done under his direction. "Yes," I said. "Absolutely yes. I've thought a lot about what I should have done differently. There are people who will tell you that I should have spoken up in that conference room, that I should have interrupted Brandon when Marcus asked about the typography and just answered the question. Maybe they're right. Maybe the moment I stayed silent was the moment I agreed to my own erasure. But I also know this. I had tried to speak up before, in smaller rooms and lower stakes moments, and what I had learned was that speaking up without evidence was just complaint. What changed everything was not my voice. It was the habit of saving the voice memo, keeping the original brief, maintaining the timestamp record, the small boring discipline of protecting your own work before you need to. The best advice I ever got about working in this industry came from a woman I interned under at 23, a creative director who had been in the business for 30 years and whose name I still drop when I need a room to listen. She told me, "Always write like you're documenting for a court that doesn't exist yet." I thought she was being dramatic. She was being practical. Brandon's administrative leave became a termination. I heard this from a former colleague who still worked at Hartwell and Cross, not from anyone official. I also heard that he had tried to negotiate, had suggested the whole situation was a miscommunication about roles and credit, had pointed out that his name had been on agency pitches for 12 years without incident. The agency's outside counsel, I was told, had found the Vantara project was not the first incident of this kind under his leadership. It was simply the first one that had been caught. My former colleague, who told me all of this over coffee on a Tuesday in May, looked at me across the table and said, "Did you know? Before this happened, did you know it wasn't just you?" I told her the truth. I had suspected. I had not wanted to know for certain, because knowing for certain would have required me to do something about it, and I hadn't been ready. Or I hadn't believed anyone would listen. The two things are not always easy to tell apart. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Priya knows. She wants to reach out to you." "Tell her she can," I said. "I have a motion design project starting in the fall." The contract with Vantara was signed in late May. Priya and I built a small independent studio, just the two of us and two freelancers we trusted, and we started work on the ritual campaign the first week of June. Diane Vasquez turned out to be exactly the kind of client you spend your career hoping to find. Specific about her vision, honest about her constraints, and willing to be surprised. The campaign launched that October. The brand concept I had developed from February through April, the visual language built from coastal minerals and apothecary archives and the intimate ceremonies of women in 1920s letters, it ran in Vogue, in Allure, in a series of out-of-home installations in New York and Los Angeles that Diane had insisted on, even though they were expensive. A creative industry trade publication covered the launch and asked Diane who had developed the brand identity. She named me. She named Priya. She described the creative partnership in terms that were generous and accurate. I have a printed copy of that article on the wall of my studio. Not because I need validation, but because there is a version of this story that ends with me at that chair against the wall, watching someone else accept a room's worth of attention for work I had done in the dark. And I want to remember, every day that I walk past that wall, that it didn't end there. It ended here. If you're working somewhere right now, doing good work, watching it disappear into someone else's narrative, I want you to hear this part clearly. Document everything. Keep your original files. Save the voice memos. Maintain your timestamps. Not because the world is fair, and documentation will always save you, it won't always. But because when the moment comes, and the right person asks the right question, you want to have something more than your word. And build relationships outside your immediate hierarchy. The person who protected me wasn't someone inside my chain of command. She was a client who had encountered my work before, in a different context, years earlier, and had remembered it. You cannot predict who will be in the room. You can decide what quality of work you send into the world. The last thing I'll say is this. Priya finished the motion work for the Ritual campaign and it won 2 industry awards. She accepted both at the podium, with her name on the certificate, in a room full of people who had been told exactly whose work it was. I watched from the audience and felt something I can only describe as right. Not triumphant. Not vindicated. Just right. Like something had finally landed where it was always supposed to be.